Welcome back to PSY 235 Social Psychology. In this video, we'll be covering Learning Objective 4.4, in which we'll be describing how culture influences social perception and attribution. When we start this conversation, typically, and I'll admit, I find this kind of frustrating that we're still kind of studying East-West differences, but that's where most of the research has been. So we'll cover it, and then we'll talk about some of the limitations of using strictly a Western culture versus Eastern or Asian culture kind of dichotomy to look at cross-cultural differences. Western cultures, generally speaking, and we're talking about Western Europe, the United States, Canada, tend to have cultural norms, beliefs, values that stress individual autonomy. So separateness, independence, strength, the power of personality, the idea that who you are should be reflected in how you behave. In East Asian cultures, so Japan, China, and to some degree Southeast Asian cultures as well, because we have some data there, the emphasis is more strongly on the group and the importance of group harmony. So there's more of an emphasis on how do my actions reflect on my group, how do the behavior of individuals reflect on the group, and so on. So in a Western context, people are perceived to be generally self-contained. You are separate from the people around you. And, since most of the people who are listening to this are from that Western cultural environment, you may be saying to yourself, what else is there? Because largely for your entire life, you've been taught that you are self-contained, that you are to be independent, you are to be a person who has boundaries, and other people are outside of those boundaries. Even if you share space with them, you are still distinct. In Eastern cultures, however, there's a stronger emphasis on who you are being defined by the groups to which you belong. Now, obviously, regardless of whether you're talking Western or Eastern culture, both of these things are true. So people have self-contained independent elements. They also have sense of self derived from group belonging at the same time. It's a matter of balance. So in Western cultures, the bias is in the direction of perceiving oneself as separate and bounded. You can still have really strong identification with certain kinds of groups, like your family, your community, even your sports team or your school. But who you see yourself as is this independent, bounded self. In Eastern culture, on the other hand, you may have a sense of your uniqueness, your individuality, but the bias is in the direction of seeing yourself as an extension of the groups to which you belong. And your behavior reflects on those groups, and the behavior of those in the group reflects on you as well. Now, this can have an impact on average style of thinking. So one area of research looking at this has examined the difference between what's called holistic versus analytic style thinking. Some of the researchers in this area have argued that Western cultures that are strongly individualistic tend to be more analytic in their style of thinking. And, part of this comes from our approach to education. We tend to be very deterministic in our thinking. We tend to be fairly linear in our thinking. We go from start to finish. Even our arguments about the scientific method are very, very linear. We tend to focus on what people or things are like, what you can see, observe, and document. We tend to pay less attention to contextual information that could actually be pretty useful for helping us understand why they're doing what they're doing. In collectivist cultures, for instance, in some Eastern cultures, the tendency is to show more holistic style thinking. And by holistic, what we mean is taking into consideration more of the environment so that you can do a better job of decoding what the situation demands of the person. And I've tried to choose my words very carefully there. So there's a stronger assumption in collectivist cultures that situations are very powerful and situations demand certain behaviors of people. And as a person in this collectivist culture, there are probably norms and expectations that you do what the situation demands of you. For individualistic cultures, it's like, regardless of the situation, you need to be the same person. Whereas in collectivist cultures, you have to take in the situation and decide what the situation demands of you. So that tends to produce a more holistic approach to problem solving, a more holistic approach to person perception, to making attributions. So here's an example of one of the studies that was described in your textbook. These are two stimuli from the same experiment conducted by Matsuda et al. And here they present each picture to viewers who are either, I believe the initial study was American students versus students from Japan. And you notice on the image on the left, you have a smiling number 2. And, the question is, what is number 2 feeling? And the faces in the background are frowning people, whereas in the right-hand image, you have a match. Smiling number 2, everybody else is smiling too. Now, for American students looking at these stimuli, so it was cartoon people presented in groups. One person in the cartoon is bigger than the others and is in the center of the image and had a facial expression that was to be interpreted. There were many versions of these cartoons. You had a happy central person, sad, angry, neutral, etc. And there were variations in the facial features of the people behind the central figure. The other people in the group, their facial expressions either matched or did not match the focal person. The task was to judge what the central person's emotions were. So what is number 2 feeling? For American participants, they simply look at the face of the focal person and make a judgment based on the facial features of that person, what they must be feeling. So if it's a happy face on that central figure, it doesn't matter what the other people look like. So if you see the happy face on the central figure and everybody else is sad, they'll say, yeah, he was happy because he beat them all. Oh, pretty standard American way of thinking. Or maybe he's smiling because he got chosen and the other people didn't. Whatever. Or maybe they're from the other team, right? So you come up with explanations of why he's smiling and the others aren't smiling, but his emotion remains intact. The facial expressions of the others for Japanese participants was much more important, and it had an impact. So let's say that number 2 is smiling, big smile, but the other people behind that figure are frowning. They'll make him significantly less happy than he is, because in Japanese culture, presenting your facial expressions, there may be a completely situational reason for plastering on a smile that isn't completely genuine. So it may be to smooth out, social demands. It may be to respond to a situation as you're expected to do. So there may be a reason why you need to have an emotional expression on your face that doesn't match the rest of the people around you. So they move the estimate of his happiness becomes lower if he's surrounded by unhappy people. It is higher if he's surrounded by other happy people. Now, social neuroscience has started to add some nuance to our understanding of some of these issues. Social neuroscientists have started to do brain imaging studies looking at these culturally based thinking styles to try and understand how the brain responds to various social stimuli. In the study that was described in your text by Hedden et al., they looked at where in the brain these sort of patterns comparing East Asian and American participants differed in their fMRI scans. So, this, it sounds more complicated than it is. If you're laying in an MRI machine, if you've had an MRI, you know it's a claustrophobic environment. But in these research paradigms, you'll be laying in the machine. They'll have a screen that you can see above you, and what they would show is they'd show an image of a line that they were to estimate how long the line was, and the line was inside of a box that they could see on the screen. So imagine a square, and then inside the box is a line, and every new box and line, every new line is going to be a different length, and you're going to be asked to estimate how long the line is. Both groups were really good at judging line length. So they were consistent, they were pretty accurate. The difference in instructions was you're to ignore the context or pay attention to the context. And what they found was that there was activation more often in higher order cortical regions, which means those areas of the brain in the frontal lobes where you're making hard decisions, where you have to flip over into higher order thinking. When they were asked to follow instructions that were the opposite of their the dominant cultural thinking style. So for American students, the dominant thing is to ignore the context and just focus on the line. But if they're asked to attend to the context and pay attention to the box that's housing the line, they have to work harder to make the accurate judgment. And that means they have to activate their higher order cortical regions, and that shows up on the MRI. For the Japanese participants, or East Asian participants rather, if they're told to ignore the context, they have to use more higher order thinking. If the instruction is consistent with their cultural style, there's less activation of those higher cortical regions. Now, I mentioned this earlier in an earlier section of the chapter. We do find some subtle differences in the fundamental attribution error across cultures. And again, most of what we've looked at is differences between Americans, Western Europeans, and people from, most of the research is on Japan, China, India, Pakistan, for example. The assumption is that members of individualistic cultures are going to tend to be biased in the direction of dispositional attributions, kind of falling into that mode of thinking like personality psychologists, whereas members of collectivist cultures are going to prefer an embedded, more situational explanation, and to think like social psychologists who know that social influence is actually a thing. What we find in this research, though, is that people, regardless of cultural context, are capable of making both kinds of attributions. So it's a matter of degree. Both make dispositional attributions. Both tend to drift in the direction of dispositional. But people in collectivist cultures are somewhat more likely to drift over into step 2, where they think harder, more readily, about contextual causes. So it's a more subtle issue, and it's a matter of degree. There are lots of situations where people who are individualistic or are in individualistic cultures make situational attributions, and lots of situations where people in collectivist cultures make dispositional ones. What is found, though, is that for people in collectivist cultures or people within an individualist culture who tend to be a little more collectivist in their orientation, they're more willing to pause and take that second step in the 2-step process of shifting to high effort thinking about the context. So to wrap things up, how accurate are our attributions? Well, our attributions and impressions are sometimes wrong, particularly if we're dealing with unfamiliar people and unfamiliar situations. We're going to use whatever mental shortcuts we have available and whatever attributional habits we tend to fall into when making social judgments in those kinds of situations. If you want to improve your attributions and their accuracy, you need to be aware of what those mental shortcuts are, such as the correspondence bias that can lead you to making the wrong conclusion. Even when those biases are fully running, generally speaking, we're decent at guessing. We're fairly accurate perceivers of other people, particularly if we're familiar with the context. Even if we don't know the person, but we know the situation, we tend to, do a pretty good job. If, however, we are under pressure, we don't have a lot of cognitive space to and energy and motivation to be accurate, that's when we're going to make more mistakes. We can be very, very accurate, but we can also be really, really bad. And a lot of it just really is determined by our own mental state at the time, how much we know about the people whose behavior we're trying to explain, and how well acquainted we are with the situation. And that concludes my coverage of Chapter 4.